Also, as the person moderating the panel, I would like to say we are taking audience questions. So if you want to, if something pops up in your head while we're speaking, please raise your hand and Sabine will run around and get questions from you. So the question is, what has to change to increase Rust adoption in industrial companies? And as direct as it is, you actually proposed the question by submitting a talk to that. So from your perspective, what is needed?
Actually, my question was from a little different perspective. So what prevents people from adopting? It's interesting to see all these people here in this room that are effectively like keen to do it. But then we have significant underrepresentation from people here in this room, from people who for many reasons don't want to or cannot or don't have chance for various reasons. I could talk a lot about it, hence my proposal. One of the important aspects to underscore, and I hope I will hear from the other side more about it as well, is the managerial perspective in companies about benefits or disadvantages of adopting us and changing the sometimes a company culture to make a switch. What are the costs? What about new hires? Who can or cannot do Rust and to what quality? And I would like to underscore quality here. Because even today, even in the publicly available crates, to a certain extent, then becomes a problem sometimes. And then we have a trouble that's partially solved today to a certain extent, thanks to efforts of Florian, starting from early from James, and then all the people who are involved in releasing Ferrocene. Because that opens the door to certain industries that were they're closed. But is that enough? There are many businesses, much smaller ones, that are built on trade secrets. They don't want to do open source for many reasons, including financial. Is Rust ready for that, as from the technical perspective and from the mentality perspective as well? I think here is a significant field to improve.
Thanks. James, same question to you. What is missing?
Yeah, I'm green. Okay, cool. Yeah, I think it definitely varies, and industrial users are different than more like internet users in that many of them don't talk in the public about the decisions or even struggles that they have. And that's one of those things where you can go to conferences for tech conferences and you learn a lot about what stacks people are using, what problems they have, what they've had to overcome and things like that. But I find that traditional industrial users that come from a much more mechanical or electrical background and things like that are much more reticent to talk. They might talk at some industry events and things like that, but it's much less in public. So it's very difficult to take the temperature of those industries and even what they're concerned about or what they think the blockers are, because they very often don't talk publicly. So you sort of rely on these informal cross-pollinations when someone leaves a company and joins another, or when they bring in a consultant. So I've been a consultant for the last couple of years, so it's interesting to go from company to company, and they have totally different visions of where Rust is and how ready it is and things like that. And also when you talk about the different parts of an organization, different parts of the organization think of it differently. So there's a lot of people who are working as engineers at these companies, and they see the technical benefits, and they've maybe even used it for projects, and so they think that it's ready from a technical acceptance standpoint. But when you start going up the org chart, different layers think of different things, but I think most management tends to think in terms of risk. And so different parts of the management are thinking of different kinds of risk, but I think that's one of those things that all of these executives are thinking, what risk am I taking by choosing a new or new-to-me technology, or even just changing what technology we're using today versus what we were doing before? And I think there's a lot of concerns like logistics, whether that's people or the code that you're using, or changing ways of operating, or just is my insurer going to be upset at me if I use a new language and it goes wrong, or is that something that they can point to? So I think it's a challenging question, like you said, of the getting all of those people to agree on that readiness level and making that. So I'm interested to hear what Steve says.
A good book. No, I'm kidding. So I fundamentally agree with both of the things that you both said, but I would put it in a slightly different way. So there's a book I read a very long time ago that had a large impact on me called Crossing the Chasm. Has anyone read this book before? So basically the idea is it's a model of technology adoption. So you have like a bell curve, and some people at the start are like people who will adopt any technology. They love technology, they do it for its own sake, and that's all they need. And on the other side are the people who are like, oh, that technology is only 50 years old. It's still too new. We can't use it yet. And so the trick is that a fundamental aspect of marketing is you need the right message for the right audience with the right context at the right time. And so what is appropriate depends on where you believe Rust is on that adoption curve, and also where you think the industry that we're talking about is on that adoption curve. And so I think the difference you just pointed out, James, that like industry, which I don't know anything about, tends to be closer to what I think in the Crossing the Chasm terms they would describe as the laggards, the people that are in the second half of the curve, and for good reason. Like, these are not moral judgments. It's just true that there's significant risk factors. Risk was mentioned as well as like a big thing. And so the needs for these tech companies that get something over the chasm, if you will, tend to be very different than the industrial users, which tend to need different things. And so I'm less of an expert in what they need to hear specifically, but I do like fully agree that what they need is fundamentally different than what you need for an Amazon or a Google or a Microsoft to adopt a technology. And I think it's pretty clear from me picking those names, like they've already adopted Rust, so we won. So we're moving further down the curve to the people who have not yet heard the good news.
Are you writing that book?
No comment.
Okay. So one question I had, very early on, someone dropped the word representation. So one of the questions I have was like, you named a lot of the big names. I don't get the feeling that we're talking vaguely about people we don't know, particularly for reasons like they don't talk, like they're not very visible. Is there a way to represent those concerns better to, for example, people that write crates, people that write compilers and are interested in moving towards those industries?
This is like kind of supposed to be the role of consultants, right? Like, you are everything that is good and bad about the things that you represent, and you have the freedom to tell people, like what you just said earlier. I've heard that, at my I've seen across many of my clients X, Y, and Z, and it gives them that layer of anonymity where they don't have to be the ones making the claim, but the expertise of secondary parties. And I'm picking consultants specifically since you brought it up, but like, I think that's definitely a really big part of it. That was certainly huge in the Ruby and Rails adoption, the legions of consultants doing things. And so I think that that kind of movement gives you the ability to have a broader perspective than even at any one particular place. So
yeah, I think that's definitely right. I mean, like I said, that pollination has to come from somewhere. Sometimes it is consultants who are brought in where they go, we've heard about Rust. I need you to sit down and give me a report. Like, does it make sense for us specifically? And they're most likely to listen to people who have experience in their industry, whether that's consultants who have helped in that industry, or even if they just play sports with someone at another company who has decided to have it. I think they need to have someone that they have some level of respect for to kind of give them that information, because you're so used to seeing marketing for everything, it's hard to tell if you're not engrossed in those communities, whether that marketing is just marketing or whether really people are actually using that. So consultants are one way. I've had a lot of companies reach out and say, hey, we're planning to do this. Is this a reasonable idea? Or a lot of other ways that this pollination happens is when people move from company to company. Or now even more exciting, when people are learning Rust in university, when they're brought in as interns or new hires, there's usually some room where every team's busy when someone gets hired. And so there's always like, you got to do something until we're ready to like take you onto our team and things like that. And so there's a lot of, well, it'd be nice to have projects. And when interns or new hires come in and they go, well, in university, I did this in Rust on embedded. Do you mind if I do that for this project? And if it's not a load-bearing project, they'll usually be like, oh, yeah, sure, go for it. And if that's one of those things where if it goes well, all of a sudden, there's no surprise. Because most engineers, I've found, are fairly driven by results and information. So when they've seen it work well, they go, okay, I can conceptualize this well. All of a sudden, I can start thinking about how we would take this into here. So I don't know from a marketing perspective how we can feed that in there, but I think organically it's definitely something that just gets pollinated as people move around, whether that's consultants or people joining teams and leaving teams and things like that. So I think it's definitely an opportunity when you come into somewhere, even if they're not using Rust. Most people are fairly open-minded if you can show them where it could work and address their concerns of where they're not sure about, because they may just not have seen that before.
So I'll address that from the little bit different angle and refer to what James said in his previous answer. So I'm not the manager, but there is a very specific managerial perspective in accepting, let's say, certain fears about Rust adoption that wouldn't be overcome by the fact that some new joiners would be doing some small side projects in Rust and even showing off. Because they are much more concerned about that, and usually it's about money on the table. So let's assume that on average most managers started their managerial career more than 4 or 5 years ago, and they didn't hear much about Rust, so they may hear about some benefits, but know about them. They will not understand it because they stopped hands-on coding when they switched to programming in PowerPoint. And this will create something that known is better. And the best things to address certain concerns would be crushing numbers. And this is actually, I believe, for somebody who would be willing to pick it up, like a topic for PhD. Doing some kind of an experimental research, it might be expensive, but maybe somebody would want to finance it. Making some kind of an experiment when you can compare 2 teams or even 3 teams working on the same product in different languages and compare the reliability and progress in writing the bugless code for this project and crush these numbers in sense of these are real results from research showing that there is a real benefit that everybody feels exists, but it cannot be demonstrated in dollars. If we can show that in dollars, that will start picking up in companies that are, by definition, very conservative in technological approach.
I just want to highlight, because that's kind of my nerd subject, that getting numbers about the effectivity of programming languages is really, really hard. So I wholly agree with that, and I think it's necessary.
Definitely agree that it's necessary. I think, like you said, it's challenging to get such objective numbers. I feel like computer science is still a young enough field that we're not good at objectively comparing many things, let alone different programming languages and approaches for things like that. But I will say definitely having companies, whether they're tech companies or other people like that, speaking publicly about that. I know recently the Android team made a comment about how their teams felt after switching to Rust, where these were teams who were very experienced in C++ and how effective they've been since then. And I think having those, even if they're from another industry, starts adding up in that proof pile, where everyone's going to say, that's not exactly my industry, it doesn't map one-to-one, but I think it starts building the case, because it's so hard to get, and there's so many different industries, it's hard to get an objective case where everyone goes, that's exactly me, I can see myself in that data, and the objective data is so clear. But I think there's a lot of circumstantial evidence and other numbers that you can start getting. And I do think having that as a library of things that you can refer to, I'm always thankful whenever companies are able to talk about that in public. So if you are a company who is using Rust, the more you can talk about it publicly, both positively and negatively, I think that is a tremendously helpful thing to me as a consultant, where I can say, here are 3 people in your industry and very close to your industry, and I can give them a much closer to home picture to them. So I definitely think that helps.
The question in the audience?
We do have 2 questions, I think. Here, this one. Oh, here. Oh, I'm so sorry.
No worries. Thank you. So thanks for the point on management and adoption in like the industry from the perspective of top down. I just wanted to also add one point from engineers' perspective, because I think if we talk about there in an adopters curve, I've also seen that there we have sometimes to feed comparable discussions. So there's those people that are really happy about the technology, adopting it, and then you will have people that would really like to try out Rust for a project, but they just need a project where they can work on it. And because there's no production level deploy tomorrow project yet in Rust, all they need is a small helper binary, a small debugger that they can work with to try out, and then later they'll be confident to pick up a bigger project. But then there's also those people that are not that happy to try out Rust. I don't know, because they've been writing another language for 15 years and they're happy about their skills there. And I think for those people, it's more about like they'll only switch once their project switches. And then they'll also be the first ones to point out all the inconsistencies and, but there you had to reach for unsafe and so on. And I think it's also interesting to think about like how can we reach those people that they are not becoming roadblocks. So I would say like people that go there by their own want, then people that just need a project to get started, and then people that actually might need convincing why it's worth the investment of looking into a new technology.
Did you also have a question?
If may I quickly comment on that? So
sure.
Your comment opens actually doors to many different threads at once. That would be, I don't think we would have time to discuss all of it. There is a kind of a chicken-egg problem here, I understand. But we would have to then discuss who are these people who would like to start something, because there would be, at least for me, at least 2 distinctive groups that would like to do it, and then there are certain implications of any work they would do at the start of their endeavor with Rust. So we have to be, again, I will return to my comment about conscious about the quality of the final work. So Rust helps you with writing better code, but it doesn't stop you from still writing a spaghettized moodboard code in the end. So there's a whole aspect and topic of actually teaching people software engineering the right way, not only in reference to Rust, but other things as well, other languages as well.
Thank you, everyone. I am curious. I just wanted to focus a bit on the metrics aspect. And metrics are difficult in software. They also are very attractive to people who are analytical, but we open ourselves up to becoming vulnerable to confirmation bias. So people receiving the report are likely to dismiss the evidence and say it's not relevant to my industry, this isn't quietly appropriate, I need something that's better, when they see something they disagree with. Or if they see a conclusion that they agree with, they're more likely to say, oh, those are wonderful numbers, and look at things uncritically. And do we have, we also need, how do we make sure that we deal with both sides, not just the numbers, but also sort of the stories that are influential at getting people to give it a go?
So you raised an interesting point regarding something I planned in my original proposal to discuss. So I call it personally Rust sorry, I need to return to my note. So the problem of Rust industry adoption is Rust's industry adoption. You said about bias and the fact that people may push away the evidence. So we have now a lot of voices coming from companies like Microsoft, Google, Amazon about how successful they are about Rust adoption, which is, you may think, oh, it's nice they do it happy. When I've had the Dropbox did something Rust, I was very happy. Oh, something started and I got adoption. But then when a company like Google stand on the scene and start talking about how successful they are, in many hats, especially on managerial positions, the lights start, yeah, but they are big, they can afford expensive engineers, they can do it. They can teach these people and send them to courses. We don't have budgets for that, so it's not for us. And it's like, the red flag number one for adopting Rust stays in the head, and it becomes very hard to erase. So that kind of narrative that comes from them does the whole idea a little disservice. James mentioned that we need more people talking about it. And I agree, because we need more diverged industries talking about their success stories in adoption Rust, not only in terms of, oh, we are much more effective, that about any potential benefits that would give them, because of all the tooling that's available, and let's say magic things that you could do around helping you with building your tools around cargo, for example, if you don't have to stick with the functional safety at this moment, then it can give a very great example where you benefit and actually save a lot of time. So it's like let's say it's a disbalance. If we have the greatest in sense of amount of money having in the pocket talking about it, it may be putting some other off because we can afford this. So it's another financial argument, and that leads then to, even if we would like to, what about the talent pool that we can pull from the market? And there is not enough graduates from universities that would know Rust good enough to even start in the positions. That might be a problem.
From James and Steve as well.
Well, I wanted to go slightly different, because I heard a slightly different part of your question of asking, we have these metrics, but how do we make sure that we're using metrics that are reasonable and applicable? So like when we're trying to make a case for it, how are we not overselling the case? How do we make sure that we're using data that's interesting? And I think that's one of those things, like I was saying, yeah, there's only so much you can apply from a Google to a Siemens or something like that. They are different organizations that operate in different ways, and that's important to look at. I think when you're trying to make a case, I think it is important to be objective and not just, here's the list of all the good things that I like and everyone who's ever said nice things about Rust. Because I think, like you said, it's very easy for people to then pick, that's not me, that's not me, that's not me, that's not me. But there are certain things, especially across industries, when you start to see consistencies, or you say, look, the whole story is not necessarily applicable, but they do this thing the same way that we do. And I think when you're making a case, either as an engineer or a manager or a consultant, you have to pick the sources that match the best. And some of that's just empathy of knowing your client or your boss or your industry and things like that. And I think it comes down to there's no one size fits all. It's knowing your industry. And this is part of why I ask more people to talk, because it's easier to empathize with these industries when they're closer to you. And so my only answer is I'm agreeing with you that it's important to do that review, and that if you just come in with the same slide deck that you would for an internet company to an industrial company, they'll pick it apart to death. And I think that will be not very useful. But that doesn't mean that none of those written material or metrics, or people who have said it made us X% more efficient or X fewer bugs, you know, when you see all of these companies reporting similar numbers, you go, well, there's definitely something to that. You know, we can't say it's exactly going to work like that here. But I think tailoring to your audience is a really important skill in any persuasive writing or speaking, in that the more you can empathize with the people you are talking to, the more you'll understand their problems, and the more you'll be able to give them things that are actually relevant to them, instead of them just getting overwhelmed and shutting down. So I don't think there is any objectively perfect metric, but I think, like you're saying, it's very important to understand that not everything's applicable to everyone, and to find the things that are closest to home for these kind of organizations.
Steve?
I don't really believe in objectivity, like, as a thing, I think metrics are useful. As you point out, many people that describe themselves as metrics driven will find any excuse to disagree with a metric they don't like. So I think metrics are useful to reach to people that believe they are metrics driven, even though they're not at all. And for that reason, what the metrics are don't really matter. But part of what the right message at the right time means is sometimes it is not the right time. And you will never convince someone that does not want to be convinced. There's like a saying about con men, like you can't con someone who is honest because it relies on them thinking that they're going to get one over on you, and then you turn it around and you con them. Not that Rust marketing is a con, but that's the thing. And so I agree with this tailoring kind of thing. You definitely want to give someone the right message for them, but it also does mean there are some people that you just will not reach, or you may not reach right now. There are people who I'll not name that I've argued with on the internet for literal years, and I've watched them over the years go from Rust is stupid, I don't like Rust, I guessed Rust is fine, I started using Rust recently, I'm using Rust all the time now. That took years, and probably not a good use of my time, but that's just true in general. I'm going to be extremely American. When Coca-Cola puts up an advertisement for Coke on a billboard, they don't expect you to see the billboard and go, oh my God, I need a Coke right now. Where is the nearest Coca-Cola? I'm going to buy it. The idea is to plant a subconscious idea that Coca-Cola is good in the back of your head, so then later, when you're walking past the Späti or whatever, not that there are Cokes there, Fritz Cola, we'll change it to something else that Americans know. Then you go oh yeah, subconsciously I have a positive opinion about that thing, and now I'm more willing to buy it in the moment. And so it's a long game, and it's not necessarily a thing where you can immediately reach everyone. So I think it is more important to generally present a variety of options and let people come to their own conclusions. We're back in the church. Open your hearts to the message, so many religious illusions out of me today. I don't know what my problem is. But that's, I think, the real thing, though, is that, and that's why people think of sometimes as people being pushy, is because if you're in the mindset where you're not going to listen no matter what, and someone continues to push, sometimes it can just make you even more, further away. So I think it is important to recognize sometimes that it's just not the right time for someone, no matter how objectively good it would be for them to make a different decision.
I think you super have to pick your battles. I mean, there, like you said, there's some people who are just very stubborn, and what they need is for someone else to be convinced. And I think, it's always hard when you want to use it and there's someone blocking you in your organization, and it feels like a fatal blocker and things like that. But yeah, there's very much time to pick your battles and find the paths of least resistance, because even if it's a side route, sometimes it may end up being what that person needs for that. So if you feel like you're talking to a brick wall, probably stop pushing. Probably go find a different route around or something like that, I think is fairly important.
We have some contributions from the audience, so we'll start here.
I was more curious getting into you brought up risk earlier in terms of managerial risk and organizational risk and whatnot. And one of the things that has come up when I've talked to some of my clients and pitched Rust to them is the concept of unknown risk versus known risk, specifically in safety critical systems and things like that. So when someone comes up to you and says, well, there's too much unknown risk here, we're, as opposed to using our standard crappy C, we know what is possibly going to happen, we know how it's going to break, and we know the impact of that, whereas this is a whole new thing. Do you think there's any is it worth pursuing trying to push further there, or is that a sign that someone's just not receptive to any kind of change?
I definitely want to ping over to Florian in a second, because I know we talked about this a little bit recently, but safety critical is interesting in that they will take, there's no need for systems to be perfect. It has to be predictable, because it's way easier to write a checklist that says, just don't this, 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 and this. And safety critical, more than any other industry, will just say, okay, I went through the checklist, we made sure we didn't do this, this, or this. And that's how they've been as productive as they have been in C for so long. C is an imperfect system, same as Rust is an imperfect system, but it's more about knowing predictably where it falls over. So I think the answer is there's all kinds of different stratifications of safety critical of how serious they are, and I think the most stringent ones will probably keep using C for quite a while, and maybe those industries aren't ready for it yet. But I know Florian has some experience of even people who are willing to adopt Rust still sometimes keep that mindset of like, oh, there's just things that I can't use in Rust because they're scary, and they don't even update the state of like, well, maybe it's not scary in Rust, or you can do that. But I know, I don't know if you can share that story, but there's a group that were doing some interesting things in Rust, and it was some carryover habits from C.
I don't know exactly which one of the many talks we had you're referring to.
Dynamic dispatch.
Oh, that was not in C, that was in C++. People prefer rewriting dynamic dispatch using pointers by themselves rather than relying on what the compiler does, is a thing. So, and we're observing that quite a bit, that people stay away from features in Rust that we could see as commonplace in many programming languages and well understood, for the reason that that's still like compiler magic. Even simple things like vtables and dynamic dispatch. But I do actually believe that some of these things are very much solvable. But we're getting a little bit into to the technical details there. Yeah.
Sometimes, what is it with the religion today? Sometimes acts of God turn the unknown risks into known risks. Like Cloudflare, for example, it was when Cloudbleed happened that they suffered a great deal due to a problem that they didn't necessarily fully appreciate that they had. And then it became no new C code unless the CTO signs off on it. And so, I'm not going to say that they were, because I worked there well after this period, so I don't really know a ton about the culture before this happened, but I'm not going to say that they were in denial of the problems of memory safety, but let's just say it wasn't top of mind for them, right? And so it was more abstract and therefore a little more unknown. And then the pain appeared and it became very real and very acute, and so a problem had to be found. And so I don't know if that qualifies as a brick wall, but it's definitely true that sometimes you have to let people discover the problems on their own.
Yeah, I find that either there is something that happens that burns it, because I think when they're measuring that risk, it's, are we okay with being 20% slower constantly versus the promise of being 10% faster? And they're trying to make those measurements, and it's always, like when I said they're managing risk, it's always sort of a gamble and things like that. And then sometimes they're either social or situational things where something just blows up. And then you go, okay, well, I was on the fence before, but yeah, okay, fine, this is fine. So sometimes it's just persistence of having that door be open to them and having them be as well informed, because when something happens, they're going to go, okay, that's enough. I'm tired of carrying that around. What are my best 2 or 3 options today? And if that's something they've had in the back of their mind, even if they're not ready for it yet, that helps a lot. Like whether it's persistence or just continued messaging. Like you said, you see it on the billboard on the way to work every single day. So as soon as something bad happens, you go, you know what, I am looking for a different soda choice. Coca-Cola, cool, I'll try that the next time I'm at the store. And I find that those brick walls can sometimes have a hole punched in them by random events, but it's hard to plan for those, but other than be persistent.
We do. Oh.
Michał, do you have?
One comment to what James has said, because he mentioned 10%, 20% improvement or disimprovement in productivity. Donato today said the words Rust make me sleep at night. I think this is a factor as well that should be somehow taken into account as well, because many companies actually care about how their employees feel about the job they're doing. If Rust leads you to frustration because you're spending days on chasing Heisenbergs caused by not implementing a canary on your stack properly in some code that has 20 years old, it doesn't toll to pay here, and obviously it should be somehow factored in. So if there is any research around that, I would be glad to hear if any psychologist would pick this up. So if whether the tool that you are using for your job, how really it influences your life.
Yeah.
Sorry, just to comment on that specifically. So you already mentioned earlier that one of the ways that Rust gets into organizations is by way of people joining, new, usually younger developers. And I think that's actually a fairly effective way, because one of the biggest problems organizations have is to find engineering talent, and specifically really good engineering talent. And Rust is one of those things that the really good developers tend to flock to right now. That's partly because it's new. There's some inherent benefits of Rust, but arguably it's also just because it's relatively new. So the early adopters, which tend to be the good ones, embrace it. And there is something to be said about just allowing those people to be attracted to your organization by saying, oh, by the way, we also do Rust around here. So I've actually seen organizations use that as a way of expanding their hiring pool and actually focusing their hiring pool on the talent that they are specifically seeking, and they accept the fact that those people will do Rust almost as a side effect. But that actually is, I think, one of the more effective ways in which Rust is currently going into organizations, because simply by hiring good engineers or very good engineers, they tend to bring Rust these days.
80% of blockchain industry rides on that marketing horse.
I was going to say, one of those things that, like I said, is the difference between a C-suite and line-level engineers of like, not every, like, what is it? Wars are won by logistics, not battles, and things like that. And I think good management tends to think of that, like, how will we continue hiring good folks? And I think it can be a double-edged sword of, yes, by having an exciting proposition, we might be able to bring in some amount, but then different industries are going, I have to hire 1,500 people next year. Can I hire 1,500 people in Rust? And 5 years ago, the answer was probably not, and now it's probably getting closer to that. And I think there's a really funny Haskell blog post, or on Hacker News or something, where they said, well, how do people who use Haskell hire people? And the answer was, well, there's not very many of them, but if you hire an average one, they're excited about the language and they're using it, so the ones you hire are probably good. Just as if you're in an industry where you only need to hire 1 or 2 people a year, it's very easy to find very good ones. And I think Rust was like that for a while, but I think Rust is actually interestingly making that, we're in the progress of that jump right now, where it's going from something that's being taught, or going to something that's being taught in universities, because there are industries that really want to hire 1,500 devs, and if they can't pay to have 1,000 of their devs retrained in Rust, then they're going to have to wait for that to be ready. But I think logistics is another one of those things that those industries think about, and I think as we move on, it's going to be more realistic for logistics pipelines of larger and larger companies to really make sure that they have a reasonable hiring plan for the next 5 years, where they're seeding the groups with a couple of people who are interested in Rust, and that becomes a larger proportion of their total hiring budget and things like that.
We're finally gaining legions of bad Rust programmers instead of only good Rust programmers like you and I.
I don't think that builds confidence.
Yeah.
I have a question. Talking about suits, talking to suits. What's your opinion of the current initiatives coming out of the White House, out of the BSI, and in Germany, for example, around pushing the topic of memory safety, and particularly the topic of Rust, even if they don't spell it out so often?
So unfortunately, my blog moves slower than the US government. I actually had been paying attention to this legislation when it was in committee, and then it had taken me so long to write the blog post, I still have not written it, and here we are now. They've already made their announcements and stuff. So I'm a little late on this one, but it is interesting. So before this stuff actually happened, and for those of you who have not heard about this, CISA and the rest of the Five Eyes had come out and said that we need to move to memory-safe languages. The White House published the results of that report, and also the European Union has a couple things that are very, very similar. What is interesting is that there's a website where you can add public comments to things, and sometimes the government asks people to leave comments on the internet, which is a great way to get feedback. But people submitted papers, and by people I mostly mean corporations, but in the US those are the same thing. And like the vast majority of them were actually very, very pro this move to memory safety. So a lot of people compare this to the ADA mandate in the 80s, and I think that the cultural context is very different. No shade on ADA, but it was very much a top-down kind of like, we are going to demand you do this for the Department of Defense. And this is much more the government being like, hey, industry, we think this is a good idea. What do you think? And the industry being like, yeah. The noticeable opposition paper was actually written by the C++ committee, surprisingly enough. Their paper was notably the only one that was like, this is stupid and bad and no one should care. I am straw-manning them slightly, but the tone is just so different than the vast majority of other responses. But a large number of companies from a wide array of industries were all saying, yes, we do believe memory safety is important. And so I think that, you know, to the C++ committee's credit, it is true that memory safety is not the same thing as safety, and safety is important. But we got memes now, and everyone's agreeing with them, so we got to push on that as hard as possible. in some level, but I'm being a little facetious. But I think it is an interesting sea change in getting people to acknowledge that a problem exists and there are solutions, and that the solutions should be preferred, all other things being equal. I don't think that it's going to be, you'll hear some people on the internet say things like, Joe Biden's coming for your C-foot guns. I don't think that's happening. This is not going to be a thing where, we hunt the C programmers down and throw them in prison if they write C code. But I do think there will be some sort of like people who will recognize that, I'm selling to the US government, and if I have an equivalent system but it's written in Rust instead of C, that's a competitive advantage. And if the government follows through on their stated preferences, that will kind of like lead those things in that direction without the big giant stick of something like the ADA mandate. So I definitely think that also, other people are seeing that happen as well. I originally learned about this legislation through someone talking about Adobe Legal, noticing they were concerned that they have a giant amount of C++ code base and they would like to still sell to the government, and we're worried about it. So, it's not just a theoretical or like nerds on the internet or, oh, those government people don't know what they're talking about situation. It's definitely much more serious than that. So I'm interested to see how it shakes out.
I think it's a talk that also addresses C-levels where they are, because most C-levels are very far removed from the actual programming, not in all companies, but in many companies. And I think it gave them a vocab term and sort of a rallying call to be like, hey, C-levels, you're going to have to think about memory safety. This is just a thing that you have to account for. And most of them just turn around to their CTOs or VPs of engineering and go, we need a plan for memory safety for the next 6 to 18 months. Please let me know what your plan is for memory safety. And it's not necessarily that it's like mandated to use Rust, but I think it is an opportunity for those, because Rust was mentioned on the list, but surprisingly less than I thought it would be in that report. But it's one of those things where people are going to have to come around and someone will have to write a slide deck that says, what is this big company's plan for memory safety for the next 18 months? And they'll have to address that question, or it'll be delegated down and back up, and then eventually someone will go, yep, that's the plan. So I think it is opening doors in that it's making it part of the consciousness of the planning decisions in these places. So I think if you're pushing for it, now is a good time to have that case ready, because someone probably in your organizations, if you work at large companies, that ripple's coming from the C-level down through engineering and back up, because someone's going to have to make a call on it and what they're going to do for the next 6 months, 18 months, or 5 years or so, when it might become more strict or enforced or things like that.
You have the closing words.
So the topic of that effectively create an interesting ripple for everyone who is deep diving C++ should actually observe that. So there are claims coming from different angles that you can still write safe C++ if you are using the right tools for the job. For me, it lies the question, okay, how much money you are willing to spend on these tools? Because yes, some of them, I use some of them. They are really great, that's a different story. And then addressing from different angle, Rust not exactly might be answer to everything every time. There are other languages that are considered memory safe and it will be fine. In that particular regard, I would say Swift is underrated, and it's the language where the Grandon Horror is working on. So it's kind of a paradox that the person who invented Rust is currently one of the co-authors of Swift language.
He hasn't worked on Swift in like 8 years.
Hasn't?
Has not, no.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Was there for a couple years, so he did work on it. You're not wrong.
The last thing I read from him was still about Swift.
He's not very public about his private matters, but he has not worked on Swift for a long time.
Okay, but it's still...
Your point is not wrong. I'm just saying
relates,
like a little factual bit.
And that's it.
There were several Rust team members that actually went to the Swift team. Gankra left Mozilla and Rust and then went to Apple and worked on Swift and then came back to Mozilla and worked on Rust again. There's actually a lot of pollination between those two.
We're going to give the last word to the audience because we're out of time for our panel. So one comment on that?
Oh my, and it's a negative one. Oh, not so much. Just as a word of caution, maybe. Earlier you mentioned that it's important to find the right message for the people and figuring out how you can actually convince them that Rust is a good idea. And it feels to me that it's actually very, very easy to get into this, look, even politicians tell you you have to do it, not on its own merits, but because the politician has decided it's bad to do C++ or something like that. And if you make fun of C++ and whatnot, I think that's not the right message. And you should be very wary of how you phrase these things, because I feel myself as still more of a C++ developer, and there are quite a few very, very competent, good C++ developers, and finding a way to reach them is not necessarily making fun of them and then finding legislation to say, hey, you are forced to do that, not because you want to do it, but you simply have to. It's just as a word of caution.
Yeah, I've done C, and I've been bad at C++, but I've done safety critical C for a very long time, and there's a ton of respect for people who are good practitioners at what they're doing. There are people who are amazing at C and C++, just like there's folks who are amazing at Rust. I think just making it obvious of the total cost of ownership of those kind of things. And I do think you need to meet those people where they are, and I don't think the intent was to poke fun at individual developers, but maybe responses to legislation and things like that.
I think there's room for everyone on the internet. There's infinite pixels is what we want to take away from this. So I'm going to say thank you because we're out of time. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, James. Thank you, Michał. Thank you, Florian. And thank you very much. And I'm going to welcome James to come up and link up his technology here and say thank you.
Thank you.